Chapter 19. The next morning, Tate hurried beneath his umbrella through the steady rain to the metal door leading into a low-income apartment building and scanned the names beside the buzzer buttons for the residents. There it was, W. Parks. The W stood for Winnie, far too cheerful a name for this rundown complex. Tate had driven the 30 miles north to Lowell that morning, thankful to be going the opposite direction of the traffic. He knew both detectives Reyes and Klein were looking for Freddie Parks, so this was probably a waste of time. But he'd learned early on that some folks didn't trust the police. In the past, Tate had occasionally been able to coax information out of witnesses that the police hadn't been able to get. One of his fellow ADAs had suggested it was because Tate had an easy face. Easy to trust. Easy on the eyes. He hadn't known what to think about the compliment when it came from a 60-something, gray-haired grandpa type. Maybe his looks and, he hated to think of it as charm, but the word probably fit, would make a difference. He was about to push the button and try to press his case for entry over the speaker when someone else climbed the couple of steps and yanked the door open. Broken lock. Great security. He followed the slouchy teenage boy into the building, shook out his umbrella, and folded it. The kid went straight down the dark hallway to the stairwell, but Tate stopped at the elevator, preferring not to work up a sweat in his suit and tie. He pressed the button. No light came on, but maybe it was blown out. He pressed it again. Nothing happened. A man and two little kids hurried out of an apartment farther down the hall. He froze when he saw Tate. Even in the dimness, Tate saw worry and suspicion cross the man's face. Tate smiled to put the guy at ease and indicated the elevator. Let me guess. Broken? Like everything else in this building. Thanks. He gave the kids a wave and headed for the staircase, where he climbed to the 4th floor. It was even darker up there. He guessed the paint on the walls had once been white. Was dreary a color? He knocked on the apartment that had been Freddie's home before prison. The woman who opened the door was the definition of bedraggled. Skinny, she had dark smudges beneath her brown eyes. Her skin had a reddish hue as if she'd spent the afternoon in the sunshine. Or maybe she suffered from rosacea. If this was the woman he'd come to see, she should be in her mid-40s, but she looked 20 years older. She wore a stained t-shirt and cut-off sweatpants that showed off legs that had probably been nice once upon a time, but now looked as wrinkly as the rest of her. In her arms, she held a toddler. Unlike the woman, the little girl looked shiny and new, wearing bright, clean clothes that seemed to glow in the surrounding gloom. She had dark brown wavy hair and big brown eyes. She peeked at him shyly, the hint of a smile in her gaze, like she was waiting to see if he was worth the trouble. I don't need any, the woman said. Good thing, because I'm not selling any. Tate flashed his most effective grin. I'm Tate Steele. Are you Winnie Parks? She squinted wary eyes. Yeah. I work for the Suffolk County DA's office. Can I come in? Why? During the drive, he'd considered how to best present himself to get the answers he needed. If he said he was looking for her son, she'd probably tell him she didn't know where Freddie was, and then slam the door in his face. I wanted to talk to you about a case I'm helping with. It concerns a man named Raul Dawson. Knowing that after Freddie had assaulted the man in Billerica, he'd run to the empty lot where Thornbrook had a trailer, Tate guessed he was at least acquainted with Raul Dawson. Maybe Mrs. Parks wouldn't be, though. This was a long shot. The red on her cheeks faded, and her lips hardened at the corners. Unless you got good news, don't you say that man's name in my presence. You and I are on the same side, Mrs. Parks. Tate did his best to hide his surprise. Do you mind if I come in? It's Miss, she said. None of that Ms. business either. I've never been married, and I've got nothing to hide. Leaving the door open, she spun and carried the child into a small living area. Tate stepped inside. As run-down as the building was, Winnie Parks's apartment was sparkly clean. A child's sippy cup sat on the kitchen table beside a plastic plate bearing the image of a Disney princess and a few leftover crumbs from breakfast. Otherwise, the room was spotless. The faded linoleum beneath his feet gleamed. The living room floor was covered with kids' brightly covered foam tile. Things. A worn sofa separated the living room from the kitchen, and a matching love seat was pushed against the wall. A plastic chest sat in one corner, the top open and toys spilling out. The little girl chose one, and settled on the foam floor to play. "Who's this?" Tate asked. "Tell him your name, sweetheart." Miss Parks's tone, brusque with him, was gentle as she spoke to the girl. The child smiled at him. "I'm Mia." "Hi, Mia, I'm Tate." Unimpressed, she went back to her toy. He usually had better luck with creatures of the female persuasion. Against the wall, the TV was playing a morning news program, but it was muted, the closed captioning showing on the screen. "I don't like her to hear the news." Miss Parks perched on the edge of the couch. "She'll learn what a crappy world this is soon enough." "Sit." Tate settled on the love seat. "What you want to know about Raoul?" she asked. "Can you tell me how you know him?" "He ruined our lives, that's how." The woman's color returned in a rush. She sat forward and glared at Tate as if it were his fault. "Him and my son were best friends all through school. Raoul got Freddie mixed up with a gang, landed him in jail." "I'm aware of your son's legal issues," Tate said. "I didn't realize Raoul was involved in that assault." "That's why he did it, isn't it?" "Because Raoul told him to. Promised him a big payoff." "Do you know why Raoul wanted that man assaulted?" "Something to do with the people he worked for." Freddie didn't know much about it, except he stood to get paid. "I was still using back then, and my boy was trying to take care of us. My fault that was. Much as I wish I could blame Raoul, if I'd have been a better mother, he wouldn't have done it." "You're sober now?" She nodded, sat up a tiny bit straighter. "Over a year ago in March, ever since my Layla was killed." "Your daughter?" Tate asked. "She got beat up. Raoul did it. Can't prove it, but I know it. Freddie does too." "Why would Raoul come after your daughter?" "To get back at Freddie. He was going to tell some lawyer lady the truth about what he done." "What truth? What was he going to tell her?" "He didn't tell me, just that he needed to tell the truth. That people got hurt because of him." "Who, though?" Tate couldn't keep the frustration out of his voice. This was new information, but so vague. "How should I know? All I know is that he told Raoul to warn him, thinking he could distance himself from the people in charge, stay out of jail. But Raoul told him to keep his mouth shut or else. Freddie only told me to warn me, wanted me to watch my back." Miss Parks was warming to her subject. "The or else was supposed to be a warning shot. At least that's what Freddie thinks. Raoul couldn't get to him being in jail, so he went after Layla. She got jumped on the street on her way to pick up the baby at daycare. She was a good girl, my Layla." The woman swallowed, shook her head. No tears filled her eyes, but the emotion was there, just below the surface. "She worked hard, helped with the rent, tried to get me." The woman's lips pinched closed. She looked away. Tate said nothing, just allowed her the time she needed to pull her emotions back in. She didn't seem the type to show them, certainly not to strangers. "Shouldn't have been fatal." Miss Parks turned back to him. "She should have woke up. They say it was a heart defect that killed her, but it wasn't. It was that piece of garbage." "Was Raoul charged?" Tate asked. "Isn't that why you're here? To charge him? Isn't that what this is about?" "I'm afraid I didn't know anything about that. We have reason to believe he was involved in another crime." "You gonna put him away?" "I hope so, ma'am." Tate gazed back at the little girl playing happily on the floor. "Your granddaughter?" "Layla's girl. She don't have nobody else. Freddie said he'll help me when he can." "Freddie is your firstborn, right?" He knew the answer. He also knew it was smart to ask easy questions. She nodded. "You know where he is?" "No idea. A couple cops called looking for him, but I haven't seen him since he got out of jail." The woman's eyes narrowed to slits. "You looking for him too?" "I need more information about Raoul, and I had a hunch you could help me. I was hoping Freddie could help too." Which was true, maybe not the whole truth, but true. "I don't know where Raoul is. Freddie's laying low, staying away from me. Said he don't want to put us in danger." "How would he? You think he tells me anything?" "I'm just praying he stays out of trouble. We could sure use another income around here." Tate nodded to the child. "Her father help?" She looked at the little girl and lowered her voice. "Her father's as useful as wet dryer lint. He don't care she exists." Tate leaned forward, also lowering his voice. "You care, obviously. Enough to get sober and offer Mia a clean, safe place to live. I'm sure Layla would be proud of you if she could see the home you've created for her daughter." The woman looked away again. but not before Tate saw the sheen of tears. Least I can do after I screwed up with my own kids. Not everybody gets offered a second chance in life. You're doing a good thing with yours. When she turned to him again, her tiny smile belied the red eyes. With God's help, can't do nothing by myself. None of us can. You and God, though. I have a feeling that's a strong combination. That is the truth. Her expression hardened again. You're not going to go after Raul for killing my girl? I'm with the Suffolk County DA, unless it happened in Boston. Pfft, should have known you wouldn't help. If Raul Dawson is up to no good, I promise you, I'll do everything in my power to put him away. And if I get any evidence that proves what you said about him attacking your daughter, I'll pass it along to the Middlesex County DA. Maybe they'll bring a case. They won't. Miss Parks looked at her granddaughter. They don't care about little people like us. With all due respect, ma'am, there's no such thing as little people and big people. All people are infinitely valuable, and that includes you and Mia and Freddie and Layla. If I can help put away the man who hurt your family, I'll do it.
Chapter 20. That morning, Misty had searched for more information about IAF's Boston property. Real estate records revealed that the nonprofit owned the land outright. A perusal of the nonprofit's website told her the lot had been donated by a corporation called Redstone. A quick Google search had returned nothing of value on Redstone, and fishing around on the county's records gave her zero information. She didn't know what was going on with Dawson and Parks, but everything seemed to lead back to the IAF property. She'd cared before. Bribery was a big deal, and people who offered bribes needed to be punished. If prosecutors adopted a no-big-deal attitude about bribery, it wouldn't be long before America turned into the type of country where slipping cash to the powers that be became the modus operandi. But there was much more than bribery going on here. Jeffrey Kofer was missing, and the police were convinced it was related to Freddie Parks. Assuming Parks had harmed him, why would he do that? She pondered the question as she and her bodyguards exited the SUV and crossed at the crosswalk before heading down a narrow walkway to a state office building. Had Parks hurt Kofer to keep him from talking? Why would he, when attorney-client privilege applied? Kofer enjoyed a successful career as a defense attorney. He wasn't about to risk that by divulging confidential information. Maybe Parks didn't understand that, or wasn't willing to take the chance. She and Tate had uncovered a few more puzzle pieces, but she still couldn't get a handle on the big picture. Her feet and the hem of her slacks were wet by the time they stepped inside the state office building. Nancy was waiting for them and hurried forward. She was in her early 50s, though the gray hair made her look older. She was comfortably overweight, the kind of woman who chose cheesecake and wasn't ashamed of it. Her access to business records had proved valuable to Misty. "I'm glad you called. I'm sorry I interrupted your work." "After what you did for my family," Nancy said, "you're never an interruption." Nancy's son had been an addict and a low-level drug dealer. When he was arrested a year earlier, Misty had worked with the court to give him the option of going to rehab instead of jail. Even though it was business as usual for Misty, Nancy had been incredibly thankful, offering her assistance if Misty ever needed it. "How's Connor doing?" "Still clean, thank God. And thanks to you for getting him into rehab." "All I did was dangle the carrot. Connor did the hard work, and you and your husband paid for it." "None of it would have happened if not for you." Nancy glanced at the bodyguards. "You all right?" "Had a little trouble with a defendant. I hoped you could look up a business for me." "Come on back." They snaked past cubicles to Nancy's office, where she sat behind her desk. Misty settled in one of the chairs on the opposite side. She didn't know Nancy's title, but the woman had enough pull to be able to access multiple state systems. "The company is called Redstone." Nancy tapped on her keyboard. "There's a restaurant that goes by that name." "Is there another company?" "I'm seeing it, but—" More tapping. It's a corporation owned by a corporation owned by— It's a mess." She looked past her screen. "It might take me a while to dig through this. Is it urgent?" "I'd like it by the end of the week if you can." "No problem. I'll call you when I have the information. Misty stood. There's one more thing. Could you get me everything you can learn about a nonprofit called International Aid Foundation? I'm on it. Nancy made a note and then glanced at her watch. You have time for lunch? Lunch? She and Nancy weren't friends, not really. But Misty wouldn't mind if they were. Behind her, Marcus cleared his throat. His voice was low when he said, Maybe you could order in? I'd love to have lunch with you, Misty said, but I'm behind on my work. Can we do it another time? Nancy's smile was the kind that lit a whole room. I'd like that. Feeling like she'd accomplished something, Misty made her way back to the door. Maybe she'd made a new friend. She could always use more of those.
Chapter 21. Tate was eager to get to Misty's, to tell her everything he'd learned, but he had to stop by the office first. After looking up and printing out all the information he could find on Raoul Dawson and Layla Parks, Tate scrambled to get caught up on his own work. You mind if I sit? Leland filled his office doorway, and Tate stood so fast that his chair banged against the wall behind him. Sure, come on in. Never in the 3 years Tate had worked for the DA had Leland come to his office. His boss settled in the small chair in front of Tate's desk. Tate felt uncomfortable as he sat in his cushy seat. I wanted to find out how Misty's doing. Really good. Tate didn't know why the DA asked him and not her, but he updated Leland on all the work they'd done together. I'm sure she spent her morning hammering out details of the plea deals. Glad to hear it. Despite his words, Leland didn't look glad. What about Griffin? Nothing new on that, as far as I know. You'd know, wouldn't you? Weren't you with her last night? Tate thought of their dinner on the roof, their walk in the neighborhood where the IAF building was located, their conversation in his apartment with Detective Klein. He thought of how he'd almost kissed her in the SUV, how he'd wished they could get back to that playful, romantic mood at the end of their night so he could make good on his promise. But news of the missing attorney had done nothing to encourage romance. How could the DA know about any of that? But of course he meant that Tate had left the office early to go over the new batch of cases with her. Far as I know, she hasn't heard anything else from Detective Reyes about the ambush. Leland consulted a piece of paper in his hand and rattled off some of the cases Misty had been assigned. As he did, Tate reported where they stood with each. And Dawson? She got that one off her desk yet? It's more complicated than it looks on the surface. Leland shifted forward on the too small chair. How so? Tate explained everything they'd learned the night before and what he'd learned that morning. As he talked, Leland's expression shifted from curious to annoyed to aggravated. By the time Tate was finished, he leaned back, lips pressed together tightly. We talked about this, Leland said, about how it's irrelevant whether there's some big conspiracy going on. I remember, but I made a promise in my campaign to return this office to swift justice, and that case has been clogging up the pipes for a year. What's the holdup? If that case is related to her intruder, I thought we agreed that it was Griffin's people who broke into her apartment. The police don't think so. They think her intruder was the convict who was released last week, Freddie Parks. This morning, I confirmed that Parks and Raoul Dawson are connected. Leland said nothing for a long moment. Outside Tate's open door, the other ADAs and support staff continued their work. Clinton walked by, glanced in, and frowned at the back of Leland's head. If he'd overheard the conversation, he'd be grinning. Finally, Leland spoke. It seems you're just as distractible as she is. The question Misty and you have to ask is simple. Did Dawson offer a bribe, and can you prove it? Leland blew out a long, irritated breath. I wanted you to exert your influence over her, and instead you've gotten pulled into her craziness. Her craziness? Tate worked to temper his reaction. You're her boss, he wanted to say. Why don't you exert your influence? Why was this Tate's problem? More importantly, did Leland really expect Misty to overlook everything they'd learned for the sake of expediency? The thought brought Tate up short, not because it was outlandish, but because, had the Dawson case been assigned to him, he'd have closed it already. He'd have uncovered none of what they'd learned because Misty had kept asking questions. But it wasn't Misty's job to sort out this mess, and it wasn't Tate's job either. That was what law enforcement was for. Look, Steele, I'm trying to give you the chance to stand out. You're smart and quick thinking, and I can see you rising in the ranks here, getting into white-collar, maybe higher-profile cases. I'm trying to prepare you for that, to help you gain the skills you'll need to do the work. Part of that is learning to deal with difficult attorneys, even the ones on your side, even the beautiful ones. That has nothing. Misty's not like you. Leland held up a staying hand, and Tate clamped his lips shut. She's never going to amount to anything more than a junior prosecutor in this office, not because she's not smart and talented, but because she can't keep her eye on the ball. You're better than that. At least you were before I teamed you two up. You get your focus back, and you'll have a great future. Tate couldn't think what to say. Half of him wanted to defend Misty, but the other half, the louder half apparently, silenced that instinct. Thank you, sir. Help Misty understand what her job is and what it isn't. If she can't learn to let the irrelevant things go, then, he shook his head, I just don't know that she belongs here. He pushed to his feet. Let me know when that case is settled, and when you hear anything else about Griffin. Tate stood as well. I will, sir. After Leland left, Tate collapsed in his chair. What was going on here? Why was Leland grilling Tate about Misty's cases, pushing him to accomplish what was her job? Was Leland really thinking of letting Misty go? After everything she'd gone through that summer, after everything she was still going through, would he fire her? And why did Tate have to know that? Why was Tate involved at all? How could he remain loyal to Misty and to his boss, to his dreams and goals and plans, to the job he'd worked so hard at? What am I supposed to do here, Lord? He sat in his office a long time, trying to hear the answer to his prayer. When none came, he shut his door and called his father. Everything okay, son? Despite Dad's thriving law firm, he always had time to take Tate's calls. I need some advice, Tate said. You have a minute? For you, always. Tate laid out everything that had happened from the moment he'd been asked to help Misty the previous Friday to the conversation he'd just had with his boss. I'm trapped. How can I do right by both Misty and my job? I have to choose one or the other. If that's the case, then what's the problem? Dad's tone was matter of fact. Not that this other lawyer isn't important, but it sounds like she's not cut out for the job. She cares about justice more than pleasing Leland. But pleasing Leland is the job, right? Doing what your boss says? Look, I have nothing against ideology, and obviously justice is important. But what have I always told you about work? Who do you work for? I work for Leland. Before that, Tate, who do you really work for? Tate knew the answer his father wanted. I work for myself. Exactly. You work for you, always. Those other things, pleasing Leland, putting bad guys away, those things are very important. They're critical. What you do matters. But at the end of the day, you work for you. Someday you'll work for your family. You're saying I should look out for number one. Tate kept his tone level, but the words tasted sour in his mouth. It's not as mercenary as that. The more power you have, the more power you'll have to affect change in the world. God needs people like you in positions of power. You can't sacrifice that because you're trying to help one woman, a woman who, it seems, doesn't know how to do her job. You need to do what your boss is asking and let the chips fall where they may. This Misty person isn't your responsibility. Would Dad say that if he knew how Tate felt about Misty? The words settled on the tip of his tongue, but he didn't speak them. Now wasn't the time. If anything came of their relationship, he didn't want his father's first impression of her to be that she wasn't competent to do her job. Tate ended the call. His dad wasn't wrong. Tate had always believed it was his responsibility to do what his boss told him. When he did, then someday he'd be the boss. Then he could accomplish great things. In order to achieve his dreams, he needed to meet powerful people, business leaders, policymakers, wealth builders. He'd been stuck in the muck at the DA's office too long already. 3 years, and he was still dealing with low-level drug dealers and minor assault cases. He needed to move into white-collar crimes. There were other options, but he had no desire to go into private practice or end up at a law firm where he'd spend his days making the partners rich. Even if he eventually became a partner, money wasn't his goal. Any decent lawyer could make partner at a law firm. Tate had higher aspirations than that, goals that felt more out of reach every day. He needed to stay focused. Leland had to do what was best for the county and the DA's office. Misty was so focused on getting justice that she allowed cases to drag on far too long. She was good at what she did, but if she didn't get faster at it, she was going to lose her job. If Tate could get her to drop the charges against Dawson, he could prove to Leland he was ready to move up. He'd also protect her position. She claimed to want to keep working for the DA's office, so closing that case would be good for her as well. It was just a bribery charge after all. The rest of it, the intruder, the mystery surrounding the IAF property, the connection to Parks, even the disappearance of Jeffrey Kofer, none of that had to do with Dawson's attempted bribery. Leland was right. Giant conspiracy or just one man's stupid decision, it didn't matter. What mattered was whether or not Dawson had offered the bribe, whether Misty could prove it in court, and what punishment he deserved. The second part, the proof part, that was where the case hinged. It would be Dawson's word against Zachary Hardy's. And even if Misty could prove Dawson had done it, to what end? Maybe a short prison term, which would probably be suspended. Maybe a fine. It was a waste of time, and if Misty didn't drop it, it would be a waste of her career. If she wanted to stay in the DA's office, she was going to have to compromise on this one. And if Tate didn't want to see all his dreams slip away, he was going to have to convince her to do just that.
Chapter 22. It was after 4 that afternoon when a knock sounded on Misty's door. Her heart flip-flopped. Ridiculous how much she'd been looking forward to seeing Tate. She hurried and flung it open. On the far side, Tate smiled. Next to him, Hughes scowled. "What did I tell you about not answering the door until you know who it is?" "I knew who it was, and besides, you're here." He didn't buzz you, just waltzed in as if he belonged. How did Hughes know he hadn't buzzed? Could he hear? Or, more likely, the guard outside had told him. "Someone was coming out when I got here," Tate said. "I thought it would be okay if I just came up." Hughes ignored him, intense gaze on Misty. "I could be dead. He could be a murderer." The man's serious expression contrasted with the smile Tate was trying to suppress. "Sorry," Misty said. "I'll do better next time." After Tate stepped in and closed the door, Misty whispered, "The guy's as serious as terminal cancer." Tate let his smile bloom. He was gorgeous already, but that smile made him nearly irresistible. "He's just trying to keep you safe." "I know." Their date the night before, walking hand in hand, almost kissing, settled between them awkwardly, like an invisible band stretching the tension. Until Tate leaned in and kissed her on the cheek, sending a pleasant flush to her face. Such a simple gesture, that kiss, but the band snapped. "Sorry I'm late." He'd said he'd be there by mid-afternoon, and it was nearly 5. "I got a lot of work done." She turned and headed for the kitchen. "Come on in." He followed her, pausing at the threshold. "What's that smell?" She'd started the meat cooking that morning. "Since it's chilly and rainy, I decided a warm dinner was in order. It's pot roast." He went to the slow cooker and lifted the lid, inhaling the scent of roasting beef. "Please tell me I'm invited to stay." "I'll be offended if you don't." He set the lid back down. "If you insist." He added a wink, then tipped his head to the pile of mail on the counter. "Shouldn't you open that?" She'd picked it up the night before, after they'd talked to Klein, but she hadn't looked through it yet. "I'll deal with it later. It's just going to be bills and junk." "I have to open my mail immediately. Always the hope there'll be $1 million check made out to me." She chuckled. "Let me know if that ever happens." Heading toward the cabinets, he said, "Do you mind if I—" "Help yourself." She loved watching him move around her space as if he belonged. Well, it was her sister's space, but the point remained. She liked the idea of him belonging where she was. Belonging in her life? Okay, they weren't there yet. She needed to tap the brakes on her imagination. Maybe she'd struggled to keep her mind off him all day, but that didn't mean he felt the same way. Tate poured soda over ice in his glass, then leaned against the counter. "Have you learned anything else about IAF?" That land on Alta Street was donated. Ah, that's why they built there. By whom? Company called Redstone. Ever heard of it? When he shook his head, she explained how she was having somebody look into it for her. What have you been up to? His grin was wide, his eyes sparkling. You'll never guess. They sat while he explained his visit to Freddie Parks's mother and what he'd learned. She interrupted to make sure she understood. You're saying Raoul Dawson and Freddie Parks were school friends? Freddie's mom thinks Raoul got him into the gang. Which might be true, might not, Tate said. Moms always blame the other kid? True, but according to her, Freddie attacked his victim. She thought back, remembered the man's name. Ernie Phillips. A building inspector, Tate reminded her. Right. You're saying he attacked a building inspector because Dawson paid him to. We already know that when Parks did it, he drove to the property at the corner of Aldous and Buttrick, which at the time had a Thornbrook trailer on it. And that's where the police caught up with him. Exactly. And Dawson works for Thornbrook, Tate said. So that tracks. Maybe Dawson was there, or Parks thought he would be. Parks went there to see him, maybe to collect his money. Maybe because he knew he was about to get arrested and wanted a lawyer. Jeffrey Kofer, she said. Whose fees, I'm sure, Dawson or his people paid. Freddie's mom wouldn't have had the money. But here's the thing. Apparently, last year Freddie was feeling guilty about something he'd done. He said people got hurt because of him, and he was going to tell, in her words, a lawyer lady. Oh. Misty pushed back from the table and paced to the far wall, putting it together. When Freddie asked me to go see him, he must have planned to tell me. Tate stood as well. That's what I was thinking. But he told Dawson what he was going to do. Miss Parks thinks he wanted his friend to distance himself or something, and Dawson warned him to keep his mouth shut. When did you go to see Parks in Walpole? She returned to the table and leaned over her laptop, searching the previous year's calendar. March 22nd. And that was how long after he contacted you? Probably 2 weeks, she said. I don't remember exactly. Tate slid a piece of paper from his bag and set it on the table, face down. Miss Parks said that Raoul threatened him to keep him quiet. I don't know if Freddie refused to be quieted or what, but his sister, Layla, was attacked on March 20th. Misty sat again. Is she all right? Tate's lips angled downward at the corners. Apparently, the attack shouldn't have been deadly, but she had a heart condition they didn't know about. Between that and the assault, it killed her. But if not for the assault, she'd still be alive. Tate flipped the paper, and Misty read the police report. I should have gotten out to Walpole sooner. You think it would have changed anything? Dawson, if it was Dawson, attacked Layla to warn Freddie off. Don't you think a revenge attack would have been worse? I don't know. Maybe he'd have been arrested. What was he going to tell me? Tate shrugged. Miss Parks didn't know. Or wouldn't say. I don't think so. Layla had a little girl. Miss Parks is raising her. She wants Dawson to pay for what he did. Was he questioned? Charged? Tate tapped the police report between them. There's no evidence. Nobody was ever arrested. Layla never regained consciousness, so she couldn't say who'd attacked her. Misty settled against the chair back and stared out the window at the falling rain. So, Freddie Parks and Raoul Dawson used to be friends, but they wouldn't be now. Not after Dawson killed Freddie's sister. Meaning they're not working together, so, what's going on? Where is Freddie? His mother said he's lying low. Avoiding Dawson, or trying to find him, maybe. She shook her head. It's all so convoluted. And you're in the middle of it, which is exactly where I don't want you to be. She didn't want to be there either, afraid to stay in her own apartment, afraid to leave the house without guards. But she and Tate were closing in on it. It was just a matter of time before she figured out what was going on and got the people responsible thrown in jail. And then she'd be safe again. Misty swirled the last bit of her roll in the dark gravy and ate it, considering how to answer Tate's latest question. The roast was delicious, but she'd been enjoying their conversation even more. By your long pause, I'd say there's a story with your sisters. He'd asked if they were close, a simple question with a complex answer. I was never that close with Crystal. She's 4 years older than I am, but that's not the reason. She was always by Mom's side, like she was trying to support her or protect her or something. Even when Dad would go into his rages, Crystal would stay until Mom or Dad forced her to leave. But Summer would grab me at the first sign of his temper, and we'd run or hide. In fact, that's my earliest memory. They were fighting. There were all these scary noises coming from the living room, bangs and screaming, and Dad yelling. And then Summer picked me up out of my booster seat. Whoa, you were that young? 4. I think I remember it because I was scared. Summer was only 6 or 7. She got me out of there. So she's always been protective? As long as I can remember. I wasn't at all surprised when she became a bodyguard. It seemed a natural fit for her. What I'm learning, what she's learning too, I think, is that her protectiveness was a defense mechanism. She's good at it because she'd had so much practice, but she became protective because Dad was abusive. I think she's trying to figure out who she is now, that she doesn't have to always watch her back. She's trying to learn what she's gifted at, who she might have been if not for our father. Tate gazed past Misty toward the window. Outside, the clouds were breaking up, allowing the setting sun to bathe the world in gold. We have these natural bents, I guess. Tate drew his attention back to her. Everybody has talents, abilities, gifts, and I think part of the key to life is figuring out what ours are and finding out how to use them, how God wants us to use them. Exactly. Misty leaned toward him. I think of the difference between me and my sisters, and you and your siblings. You grew up in a happy home, a fairly normal home, right? Tate had been telling her about his family earlier in the meal. I'd say so. Not perfect, but we loved each other. I assume you were encouraged to explore who you were and what you loved. You weren't expected to fit into a certain mold. You were given the freedom to be who God created you to be. Tate nodded. Though the action was so slow, she wasn't sure if he agreed or was simply contemplating what she'd said. Finally, he nodded slowly. Yes. The word was tentative enough that she put her point aside. Yes, but? We were a happy family, all encouraged to find out what we loved and what we were naturally good at. Our parents encouraged us to seek God and follow His leading. That sounded pretty perfect to Misty, but she could tell there was more to the story. That worked for 3 of us. But my older sister Hannah has a learning disability. She was held back in school, so she and I were in the same grade. In high school, I took AP classes while Hannah struggled in the mainstream classes. I realize now how that probably made her feel, underachieving compared to her younger brother. At the time, he shrugged. I'm ashamed to say I liked it. I was always competitive, and I was winning. Since I could never beat Derek, it was nice to beat Hannah. But it wasn't a competition. Right, it shouldn't have been. But that's what I see in retrospect that I didn't see at the time. My father, he wanted us to all work hard. He always talked about how difficult the world was, how we'd have to fight for what we wanted. He always compared us to each other. You were smart, Misty said. A high achiever. You probably came out pretty well in those comparisons. He shrugged. Hannah never won. Mom and Dad hired private tutors for her, got her into programs to help her overcome her disabilities. They did everything in their power to ensure Hannah would be successful. Except make sure she understood she was good enough, Misty guessed. Good enough just like she was. Was she? Misty asked. In high school, she started dating an older guy who got her into drugs. She quit school just a few months shy of graduation, moved out of the house, and in with her boyfriend. The day she told our parents her plan, Mom begged her to reconsider. What did your dad say? You want to ruin your life, that's your choice. But when it all falls apart, don't come running to me. Oh, no. I've never seen my mother so distraught or my father so angry. I was furious with all of them. I don't think I spoke to my dad for weeks afterward. Not that I didn't understand. Hannah's choices crushed him. I was furious with her, too. Where is she now? Her boyfriend dumped her a couple years later. She'd called Mom a few times over the years, but when the loser kicked her out, she was afraid to go home. She ended up in a homeless shelter. The thing is, Mom was always reaching out to her, trying to make sure she was all right. And she always paid for Hannah's phone. Mom called her one day, found out where she was, picked her up, and took her to rehab. What did your dad think about that? I honestly thought their marriage was going to end that weekend. I was home from college, but I think they forgot I was there. I heard the whole argument. Dad said he wasn't paying for rehab, that Hannah deserved what she got. Mom said he was paying for it one way or another. He could write the check now, or it would come out of their divorce settlement. Whoa! Tate laughed, though there was little humor in it. My mom is the sweetest woman in the world, but she's fierce when it comes to her kids. They paid for Hannah's rehab, and she got clean. She's a hairdresser, and she's really good at it. I think that's the thing. She didn't need to make good grades to be successful in a career. But Dad didn't see it that way. To him, bad grades meant underachievement, and underachieving was unacceptable. But we're not all book smart. There are other ways of measuring intelligence. Exactly. Hannah figured that out. She's dating one of her customers. I think they might get married. She and your dad are okay? You know how families are. The history doesn't go away, but we have to learn to look past it, right? To love each other despite our flaws and failures. You've forgiven them both? Oh, yeah. Dad shouldn't have done what he did, but I can understand his frustration. He tried so hard to help Hannah, and she defied everything he believed in. I think he thought if he gave her an ultimatum, she'd give in to his demands. She'd finish school and get her act together. Dad was trying to do the right thing by her. But she was stubborn. And so was he, Tate said. Huh. Misty considered all he'd said, alongside what she knew about Tate. Is that why you're so ambitious? A desire to please your father? His head tilted to one side. He seemed about to speak, but caught the words before they left his mouth. After a moment, he exhaled. I was going to say no, but maybe. Ambition is such a part of me, it never occurred to me to attribute it to my dad. But it tracks, she said. Your father values achievement, and you crave your father's approval. He averted his gaze, thinking about what she'd said. Or had she annoyed him with the observation? Would he be angry that she'd seen that in him? Maybe storm out or deny it, even when it was so obvious? She waited for an irrational response, certain she'd pushed a button she shouldn't have pushed. At least she didn't have to worry he'd fly off the handle like her father would have, had anybody dared to analyze his behavior to his face. Tate's eyes narrowed. His lips pressed into a line. He focused on something beyond her, or perhaps on something not in the room at all. Then his face cleared. He set the glass down and leaned toward her. I think you might be on the money. I've always wanted to achieve something big, something impressive. It felt like that's what Steeles should do. Dad is the founding partner in one of the most successful law firms in New England. Derek, my oldest brother, is moving up in rank in the Navy. Caroline is one of the highest-earning brokers at her firm, and she's only 26. And then there's Hannah, Misty said. Right. The only underachiever in the family, and Dad barely spoke to her for years. Tate seemed to contemplate that for a few moments. Misty stayed quiet, giving him the space to think it through. Finally, he met her eyes and smiled. Obviously, ours wasn't the perfect family, but my parents weathered it. Hannah's okay. Mom and Dad did their best, which I guess is all we can ask. And if I'm a little too focused on achievement, maybe I need to spend some time with the Lord on that. He forked a bite of mashed potatoes. We were talking about you, though. Just like that, Tate was past it. Not defensive, not annoyed, just thinking it through. She liked that. She liked that she could trust his rationality to hold, even when he was pressed. My family was different from yours, she said. It wasn't safe. I think we all, my sisters and my mom, felt like we had to be quiet, to blend into the walls. The last thing any of us wanted was to set Dad off. It wasn't that we couldn't explore what we loved, but we couldn't express it. We couldn't get excited about anything because Dad always took it personally. I guess he felt like a failure, and anybody's success made it worse. So we all just hid. I don't even know if that makes sense. Tate nodded. You're all successful now, though, right? I got to know Crystal this summer. She seems happily married, has good kids. I'd guess she loves her life. I think Crystal set out to create a family completely different from ours. Misty sipped her water, contemplated what she'd said. Except, not completely different. Mom was amazing. She loved us so much. If Summer were here, she'd say Mom didn't love us enough to protect us. But I don't think that's accurate. I think Mom loved Dad just as much as she loved us. She felt trapped, like she couldn't love us all at the same time. For years, I blamed the church for Mom staying with Dad. But I think she didn't leave him because she didn't want to. She loved him. Why, I have no idea. Crystal, I think, has dedicated her life to being like Mom in all the good ways. Your mom was a Christian, right? At her nod, he said, I bet she prayed for you 3 every day of her life. Maybe that contributed to your success in life. I know Mom prayed for Hannah constantly after she moved out, and she attributes the fact that Hannah came home and got clean to God's work. Maybe you and your sisters are bearing the fruit of your mother's prayers. Oh, Misty'd never considered that, but it made sense. Mom might have died young, but her prayers wouldn't have died with her. Mom's prayers were probably still affecting their lives today. Mom had always seemed so powerless, and yet, if Tate was right, maybe she was the most powerful person in their household. It was a little mind-blowing to consider. But you and your sisters aren't close. Tate brought them back around to the question that had begun the discussion. That's my fault. After the kidnapping, I wanted to put all my past behind me. My dad, which makes sense, but also my sisters. Summer and I stayed with him for a while, and being in his house again reminded me of all the ugly things. Even though he was different, he'd quit drinking. He'd been trying. He's still trying, I think, to get his anger under control. Still, I couldn't stand it. So, I moved out. I decided I wanted to be a lawyer, and I worked hard for it. And along the way, I sacrificed my relationships with them. Why? The question held no censure or rebuke, just simple curiosity. She sighed, hating the answer, but choosing to be honest. Like Tate had been honest. I blamed Summer for the kidnapping, which was irrational, but she'd always been my protector, and when I was in danger, I felt like she'd failed. I knew intellectually that was wrong. I was being unfair. But emotionally, I guess I'd attached my safety to my sister, as if it was her job. It took me years to get past that. And when I did, Misty sighed, not wanting to go on. My behavior is so stupid. It's embarrassing. Tate smiled. You seem so perfect. Ha! We both know that's not true. He shrugged, his lips tipping up. You seem pretty perfect to me. You had an irrational reaction to a bizarre and terrifying situation that just makes you human. Misty was plenty human. It was years before I realized what a jerk I'd been. I needed to apologize, ask her to forgive me for being an idiot. Did you? When I spotted Summer on a dinghy, motoring to that evil man's yacht, I thought I'd never see her again. I thought I'd missed my opportunity. She was glad Tate knew enough about her latest kidnapping that she didn't have to explain herself. I was sitting on a rocky piece of land, so cold I thought I'd freeze to death, and all I could think was how I'd screwed up the most important relationship of my life, and I'd never be able to fix it. I hardly knew anything about God, but I've never prayed so much. She pressed to the back of her mind the memory of the cold, terrifying time. A few weeks after we were rescued, she said, John asked Denise to marry him, and we were all invited to watch. They had a big party afterward. When it was winding down, I took Summer and Crystal aside and asked them both to forgive me for cutting them out. And they did, just like that. And Crystal and Summer had some stuff to deal with from our childhood, and they both apologized. Misty remembered the scene so well. She and her sisters sitting at the picnic table in the park on the shore of Lake Ayasha. The sense of grilling meat, the people talking and laughing, and the three of them bent close, pouring their hearts out. Hugging, weeping. It was a big cry fest. Even now, just thinking about it, Misty's eyes filled. She laughed and swiped away the tears with a napkin. Sorry, it's good to have them back. Sounds like God was in that whole situation. He ate another bite of roast. Maybe I should do that with Hannah. Apologize to her for always winning? He laughed. Yeah, how would that go? Maybe you can find a better way to phrase it. Let's hope. Tate pushed his plate away. I have to stop eating, but it was delicious. Thanks. She stood and reached for his plate. Let me just get these rinsed. She cleared the table and put away the leftovers, not bothering to waste time washing the dishes. When she joined Tate in the living room, he turned from the gas fireplace. I hope it's okay. He'd lit the flames and lowered the lights in the room. Of course. Better than okay. She sat on the sofa, and he settled on the space beside her. But he didn't stay there long, instead pushing up and angling to face her. I need to say something, and maybe it's... He shook his head, offered her a self-conscious smile. This is going to sound... I don't know. I just wanted to say that I like you. Oh. Her heart fluttered. She couldn't seem to think how to respond. Wow, I sound like a junior high school kid. His face turned an adorable shade of pink. Anyway, obviously you knew that. We've been eating dinner together and held hands and... He gestured to the fire. This isn't exactly a work environment, but since we also work together, I thought I should make it clear. I've always had great respect for you. You're smart and capable and passionate. It's so strange to think, all these years we've known each other, I've never seen you as anything except a rival and colleague. I mean, obviously, you're attractive, so that's not entirely accurate. He paused again, smiled, glanced at the flames. Anyway, now that I know you, I really like you. I feel like you could matter to me, to my life. Like maybe this could turn into something. While he gazed at her, his expression serious, maybe a little worried, she turned over everything he'd said, taking a moment to gather her thoughts. He'd always seemed blindly ambitious. Now she understood his ambition, the family he'd come from, and the pressure he must feel to succeed. He was efficient at work in an effort to please his boss, not to be a suck-up, but to be a superior employee. There was humility in that. Tate laughed, the sound low and nervous. It would really help if you'd say something. I like you too, a lot. He smiled, his white teeth gleaming in the firelight. Well, that's good. If you didn't, the whole working together thing was about to get really awkward. She took his hand, which felt forward, and then felt so right as he closed his long fingers around hers. It's funny, she said, having my house broken into, almost walking in on an intruder, all the fear and confusion and mystery we've dealt with. It's funny that something so scary could lead to this. He leaned in closer. I think that's how God works. He uses the hard things to open our eyes to his blessings. He allows the hard things because he doesn't want us to miss what matters. Like Tate. Like the thing brewing between them. Could it matter to God? Could it be his plan for her? Maybe. She was only just learning about him, but maybe what they said at church was true. God loved her and had good plans for her. Plans that might include Tate. He brushed her hair back, then slid his fingers against her scalp, raising goosebumps on her skin and desire much deeper. He closed the distance between them. The instant their lips touched, her body responded with a flush of heat and pleasure. She let go of his hand and wrapped her arms around him. Never letting their lips separate, he shifted her legs until they draped over his, moving her into his embrace. He deepened the kiss, and she lost herself in it, lost herself in him. How could this man she'd barely tolerated a week before have such an effect on her? How could he awaken her to yearnings she'd hardly known she had? But as their lips moved together, as the heat of his body raised hers, she found herself imagining more of this, more of him. When, too soon, he ended the kiss, she wasn't ready to pull away. She gripped the shirt at his back and pressed her cheek against his chest, his heart racing beneath her ear. She had no idea how it happened. But Tate was exactly what she wanted. And what she wanted wasn't out of reach. It wasn't some big out there desire, like truth and justice. No, Tate was real here, holding her close. For the first time in her life, Misty wanted someone who wanted her back.
Chapter 23. Tate fell asleep with a smile and woke up with a sense of dread churning in his stomach, much heavier than the pot roast he'd eaten too much of the night before. He shouldn't have done it. It had been stupid and selfish, and he shouldn't have done it. Not that he could make himself regret confessing his feelings to Misty. He did like her, a lot. He'd been looking for a woman to spend his life with for years, never realizing the woman he was seeking was working in an office down the hall. Before now, the timing hadn't been right. She hadn't been a believer until recently, and they'd both been focused on their careers. Now it felt perfect. Almost perfect anyway. But confessing his feelings and kissing her, those should have waited until after he'd talked to her about the bribery case. He spent more time in prayer that morning than usual, begging the Lord for guidance. There was no clear "do this and it'll all work out" answer. One thing he knew was that he needed to see Misty immediately, before work, and tell her what he should have told her the night before. She'd be angry, justifiably so. But how angry, and would she forgive him? He skipped his workout and took the T to Kenmore Square, then walked a few blocks to the apartment building. Like the evening before, somebody was coming out as he approached. Unlike the evening before, though, Misty wasn't expecting him. He pressed the button. "Yes?" Misty said a moment later through the speaker. "It's Tate." The door clicked, and he let himself in and climbed to her floor. He nodded to her bodyguard, who looked Tate up and down like he'd study a serial killer. "We met a couple nights ago." The man said nothing, just shifted away from her door so Tate could knock. This time she said, "Who is it?" "It's me." She pulled the door open. "Hey." Wearing jeans and a short-sleeved shirt, no shoes on her feet, she flashed a wide, happy smile. He'd known she was beautiful, but when she looked at him like that, like he'd made her day just by showing up. Wow. "What are you doing here?" He stepped inside and closed the door on the grumpy guard. "I need to talk to you." "Okay." Her eyes gleamed as if she were in on the joke. He wished he could return the expression. He wished he were there to pick up where they'd left off the night before. There'd been a lot of kissing, laughing, chatting, and more kissing. He'd forced himself to leave when he started considering other options. The cold shower when he got home had helped. Now all he wanted was to take her in his arms. Once he said what he needed to say, she might never allow him to again. "You want some coffee?" "I can't stay. There's something I should have talked to you about last night." "Get distracted, did you?" "You have that effect." He took her hand and led her to the couch, then changed his mind about sitting beside her. He settled in the chair. The gleam in her eyes dimmed. "Something wrong?" He took a deep breath. "Don't be mad at me, okay? I'm just the messenger." She sat up straight. The flirty attitude slipped off, and suddenly she was all prosecutor. "Whose message?" "Leland's." "What?" "He wants you to get the Dawson case taken care of immediately." "Huh." She pushed to her feet and paced. "Why doesn't he talk to me himself?" "I don't know. Probably because you and I have been working together, and I'm at the office and you're not." "I can fix that." She started toward the hallway that led to her bedroom. Tate propelled to his feet and grabbed her hand. "Let's just talk." She turned and pulled away, but she didn't continue down the hall. "I'm not dropping that case, Tate. I can't believe you'd suggest it after everything we've learned." "I'm not saying we drop the whole thing, but the bribery is a separate issue. Whether Dawson attacked Layla Parks, whatever is going on between Parks and Dawson and Thornbrook, all that is separate from the bribery." "Is it?" "You're the one who made the connection between Parks's assault victim and Dawson. The victim was a building inspector. The assault had to be related to Thornbrook, maybe even paid for by them. I'm hoping to track down Phillips, the victim, today. See if he knows why Parks attacked him." "I'm not saying there's no connection. Obviously, there's more going on here. I'm saying if there is a larger conspiracy or something, it's unrelated to the bribery charge." "But it's not. Or at least it might not be. Maybe, but that case is separate. The questions are, did Dawson offer Zachary Hardy a bribe, and can you prove it? So that's it. Back to dropping cases we can't win, or offering pleas to get them off the desk. No sense of justice or rightness? Expediency wins at all costs? I thought you were past that. Past doing my job well? You thought wrong. He took a breath to temper his frustration. This isn't about me. Leland's your boss. Your job is to do what he wants, and he wants it dropped. Even if he's wrong. Yes, even if he's wrong. Do you think anything is worth fighting for, or do you always cave? He took a step back, surprised, hurt. I've been on your side through all of this. I'm still on your side. I've been fighting this battle for days. Her eyes hardened. Her mouth opened, then snapped shut. She swiveled and started down the hallway. What are you doing? He called. I can fight my own battles. I'll see you at the office. She disappeared into her room and slammed the door. Don't! But she wouldn't hear him now. He leaned against the door jamb and waited. 15 minutes later, she stepped out. She'd put on makeup and twisted her hair into a bun. She wore a white blouse under a navy business suit, a pair of stilettos dangling from one hand. She froze when she saw him. Why are you still here? You're working from home because somebody at the office leaked information about our meeting to the intruder. Somebody with access to the office calendar is working against you, which means it's not safe. I think you should continue to work from home. I'll be fine. If you believe that, you'd have been there all week. She passed him on her way to the kitchen. My bodyguards can keep me safe. I've stayed home because I was nervous. But I need to quit allowing my irrational fears to keep me imprisoned. Your fears aren't irrational, Misty. Tate followed, stopping at the threshold. She shut off the coffee maker and slid a container of milk into the refrigerator. Someone shot at you the other day, he said. Somebody broke into your apartment. Griffin knows better than to try that again? She moved to the sink. It's just a matter of time before Reyes and the police find the shooters and bring them all into custody. There's still Dawson and Parks. She straightened from putting a dish in the dishwasher. Which you want me to drop? Leland wants you to drop the bribery case. And yeah, honestly, I do too. I want you to turn over everything you know to the police and let them handle it. They won't do anything. You don't know that. They're equipped for this sort of thing. Much better equipped than you and I are. The chill in Misty's glare felt frostier because of the heat they generated the night before. We don't even know what crimes were committed, she said. What are we going to tell them? Exactly, we have no idea what's going on. So we turn over what we do know and then step away. If you do that, you'll be safe. Will I? Tate cut off the assurances he was about to utter. Would she be safe? She'd started on this quest because she'd been threatened. The threat had come first. I don't know. I think so. Well, for sure, let's risk that. I'm not saying get rid of your bodyguards. I'm saying drop the case, turn over everything you know and move on. Get back to your normal life as much as you can. Maybe, probably, whoever broke into your apartment will just get away with it. She wasn't wrong, but neither was he. They weren't cops. They weren't in the business of hunting bad guys. Hopefully they'll go away. I'm not saying you go back to business as usual. Obviously, you'll need to keep being cautious, but maybe it'll blow over. So you think I should let it all go, Misty said, just to please my boss, a man who doesn't know the half of what's going on? Not to please him, but Tate's argument sounded feeble. Though Leland hadn't told Tate to keep their conversation between them, confidentiality was implied. But Misty needed to understand the other issue at play here. Leland might have suggested that if you can't let that bribery case go, it means you're not cut out for the job. I'm trying to help you here. Her skin paled. She moved to the table and dropped into a chair. He's going to fire me? I hope not. Tate pulled out the one beside her and sat. I just think, for the sake of our careers, you should do what he says. Her eyes popped wide. What do you mean our careers? Your career. And he wants me to get you to do it. So if I don't sacrifice my beliefs, don't be melodramatic. Is that what I am? Fighting for justice makes me melodramatic? This isn't a capital murder case, Misty. If you don't want to drop the charges, then don't. Offer a plea. If you took it to court, you'd just as likely lose as win. It's one person's word against the other. It's not that big of a deal. It's a big deal to Freddie's mother. If Dawson killed her daughter, then the Middlesex County DA should bring charges. Getting him on a small-time bribery charge isn't going to achieve justice for murder. But that's not what you care about. All you care about is your career. You want me to drop the charges so it'll make you look good to the boss. That's not what this is about. Right. Let's not make this about you and me. You made it about you and me when you told me that you liked me. And she gestured to the living room, where they discovered how well they fit together the night before. Got too close. Her words sent his heart racing. What happened last night has nothing to do with this. Of course it does, because you know if you told me this before, then that, again she waved toward the couch, would never have happened. Interesting timing. You want me to admit that I confessed my feelings before this conversation on purpose? Fine. I admit it. I was afraid that if I encouraged you to drop the charges, you'd get angry and push me away. So it didn't mean anything. You're just trying to manipulate me. No! His shout reverberated as he pushed back in his chair and stood. Is that what you think? That I'd use you like that? How would I know? Tate squeezed his hands into fists, trying to let out some of the tension building inside. He closed his eyes, took a breath, blew it out and opened them again. Misty was watching him closely. If he didn't know better, he'd swear he saw fear in her expression. He settled back on the chair, laid his hands flat on the table. I'm sorry I yelled. She blinked. It's fine. If I made you nervous, then it's not fine. I hope you know, no matter what you said or did, I would never hurt you. That's not the kind of man I am. Her head bobbed, a series of short nods that said she wasn't sure but didn't dare disagree. Inching his hand forward, he flipped it palm up. These are two different things. There's work and there's you and me. Everything I said last night is true. I wanted to say it before we talked about Dawson because I wanted you to know how I feel. Okay? Her gaze flicked to his palm. Then she slid hers against it. Her hand was cold and he covered it with his other. Let's not make this bigger than it should be. I want what's best for you. Not just that you'll be safe, but that you won't lose your job. And you want what's best for you. Her words were flat. Though she was letting him hold her hand, she wouldn't look at him. He angled into her line of vision. Is that bad? Is it bad I'm trying to protect my career too? She swallowed. No. I didn't ask for this, you know. I didn't ask Leland to assign me to help you. I'm glad he did, don't get me wrong, because it's given us an opportunity to get to know each other. But he hasn't been happy with either one of us this week. He should direct his displeasure with me toward me. Not that Tate minded taking some of the heat off her. It might end up being bad for his career, but Misty was worth it. He's the boss, so we can't exactly tell him that. She bit her lip, an unconscious gesture that had his pulse racing for a different reason. Everything about her drew him to her. How had he missed it for so long? Will you please stay home one more day? He asked. I know you'll probably be safe at the office. It's the getting to and coming from that makes me nervous. You'd be back in an old routine, which anybody could learn and use against you. I went out yesterday, it was fine. But nobody knew you were going. Look, you know Leland's not in the office most Fridays anyway. I heard him talking about some big event this weekend he's getting ready for, so he's probably not going to be there today. Maybe we can figure this out by Monday. If nothing else, we'll have had a couple more days to think it through. When she said nothing, he leaned in. Please? Her eyes narrowed like she was annoyed, but he caught a hint of amusement at his begging. Fine. He allowed a moment of relief. He had until Monday to talk her into dropping the charges against Dawson and turning all the information they dug up over to the police. Maybe if he used his charm, he could convince her. He could protect her and protect both of their careers. Either that or Misty would prove to be as stubborn as he'd always suspected.
Chapter 24. That morning, Misty focused on her other cases, but she couldn't stop thinking about Tate. It wasn't fair to be angry with him for passing along Leland's message. It also wasn't fair to expect him to sacrifice his career and ambitions because she was too stubborn to drop. or at least settle, a simple bribery charge. Misty had spent enough time in counseling to understand that her emotions didn't always track with what was fair or true or right. She was trying to be reasonable, to trust that Tate had been honest with her about his feelings, not manipulating her into doing his bidding. She was trying, but it wasn't easy. She'd thrown herself wholeheartedly into those kisses, and she and Tate had talked for hours. She'd shared things with him that she didn't share with anybody. Tate had listened, asking questions every so often to be sure he understood. He'd been tender and gentle, and, if it was all an act, what a fool that would make her. She could imagine him laughing all the way home, congratulating himself on getting her right where he wanted her. But no, that wasn't who Tate was, and she refused to let her anxieties screw this up. She hadn't asked for his help, but she was learning how to accept it, something she'd never been good at. She didn't want to go back to doing everything by herself. She hadn't realized how lonely she was until Tate. So she and Tate didn't agree on everything. So what? There'd probably be a lot of that in their future if they stayed together. They approached their jobs very differently. But if they wanted to have a real and growing relationship, if it had any chance of blooming into something bigger, then they would have to learn to leave work at work. After contemplating everything Tate had said, she knew he was right. Whether she dropped or settled the bribery case wouldn't matter to the other things she was learning. And as much as she didn't want to lose her job, she really didn't want Leland to take out his displeasure with her on Tate. She dialed Dawson's lawyer, who of course wasn't available. "Ask her to call me on my cell." Misty left the number. "It's regarding the Raoul Dawson case." She hung up frustrated, but at least she'd started the process. Next, Misty found a home phone number for Ernie Phillips, the building inspector Parks had assaulted. She called, but nobody answered the phone. That was the kind of day she was having. She left a message for Ernie Phillips to call her back. She started a plate of leftover roast beef warming in the microwave and picked up the week's worth of mail she'd been avoiding. The bills went in a pile, the flyers offering everything from faster internet to lower insurance straight into the garbage. One piece stood out. It was a business-sized envelope with her address handwritten in a messy scrawl. There was no return address. She opened the flap and pulled out a white, unlined piece of paper. A short note was written in the same handwriting. "They're watching you. Be careful. There's more going on than you know." Her stomach swooshed as the microwave dinged for a meal she wouldn't be able to eat. Who'd sent this? Who was watching her? Who were they? Her heart raced, and she fought a sudden need to run. Masked men haunted her memories, hovering at the edge of her vision, as if, should she turn too fast, she might catch a glimpse. Those masked men seemed to be closing in. She closed her eyes, tried to focus on what was real. She was safe in Summer's kitchen. Nobody was coming for her, and if they did, the bodyguards would protect her. She breathed in and blew out, praying for peace and waiting until God answered. Amazingly, he did, and her heart rate slowed. Still, she held the letter in shaking hands. Her anxiety might have been overblown, but the letter was real, not memory or hallucination. Someone had written it, stamped it, mailed it. She needed to think logically. What was true about it? It had been mailed to her apartment, and she hadn't been there in days, and she'd already known they, whoever they were, wanted to watch her. Or, more accurately, listen to her, since they'd planted bugs in her apartment. The note said there was more going on than she knew. Obviously, were she and Tate on the right track? Maybe, maybe not. Scary as the note was, it contained no new information, except that somebody had tried to warn her. Who? Jeffrey Kofer? It would make sense that Freddie Parks's attorney might want to reach out to her anonymously. Maybe, constrained by attorney-client privilege, he felt compelled to try to warn her about an attack from Parks. She checked the postmark. The letter had been mailed from Boston on Monday, 3 days after Kofer had tried to reach her. So maybe he decided he couldn't risk a call, and instead mailed a note. Or maybe the note wasn't from Kofer. Or maybe Kofer had sent it knowing Dawson might be after her. But how would Kofer know that? And why would Dawson have anything against Misty? Sure, she was the prosecutor assigned to his case, but threatening her could only hurt him. And over a small-time bribery charge? Maybe Dawson knew she and Tate were digging into the whole Thornbrook IAF business. But if that were the case, then Tate would be in danger too. Was he? Should he be watching his back? Or maybe this note was from somebody associated with Kyle Griffin. She could still see the man's face on the far side of the train window the other day. He'd looked furious. The memory dripped a chill down her spine. She dialed the police station. "Detective Reyes, please. It's Misty Lake." A moment later, the detective came on the line. "You all right?" She explained the letter. "I'm thinking maybe it came from Jeffrey Kofer." "Can you see the postmark without touching it?" "Already looked," Misty said. "It was mailed Monday in Boston." "Don't touch the letter or the envelope again. I'll get a uniform over there to pick them up." "Okay." By the detective's tone, Misty had the strong impression there was more going on than she understood. She snapped a photo of the note and the envelope, knowing she'd soon lose possession of both. "Did something happen?" "I'll be in touch. Stay out of trouble." The call ended. Strange. The stupid microwave had continued to ding every 30 seconds, reminding her of her lunch. Misty took the plate out and put it straight into the refrigerator. Her stomach definitely couldn't handle meat and gravy now. She grabbed a handful of crackers and returned to work, though it was harder to concentrate than it had been before. She wasn't sorry for the interruption when her phone rang. "Misty Lake." "It's Nancy. I got most of the information you wanted. I'm still digging, but I thought I'd share what I know." "I appreciate that." Misty sat in front of her notebook and pen. "Shoot!" Redstone is a real estate development company. It's a division of a larger corporation called HMI, Hothmarks, Inc. Nancy spelled it, and Misty wrote it down. "That's a weird name. Is that a thing? Hothmarks?" "Not as far as I know. Redstone is just one of its subsidiaries. I got the board members." She read off a list of names, and Misty wrote them down. None of them sounded familiar. "I'm still working on getting an employee list. I did learn something else about IAF. Did you know they were awarded a federal grant for the resettlement of refugees? I can send you the details." "That makes sense. That's what IAF does." "Yeah, but the grant is supposed to be used for housing. IAF has a refugee property in Hopkinton. Hearts and Homes. I know, but the thing is, this grant was awarded last year. Their Hopkinton property was completed a few years ago, right? Maybe they used the grant money for improvements, or to add apartments. The paperwork I'm looking at indicates that they used the bulk of the funds on the building in the city, the property on the corner of Aldous and Buttrick. The one you said was donated by Redstone. But that's an office building, isn't it?" "According to the information I have," Nancy said, "which is why I'm confused. The paperwork could be wrong. Maybe it's housing. The area is zoned for residential." The building Misty had taken to be IAF's headquarters certainly looked like an office building on the outside. Could it be a home for refugees? If so, it was an extravagant one, with marble floors and stacked stone walls in the lobby, and a 24-hour guard. Had IAF used grant money intended to house refugees to build themselves a cushy office building? If so, what would it mean for IAF? Had Redstone donated the property in good faith, assuming it would go to people fleeing oppression and war? Did they know it hadn't been used in the way they'd intended? More puzzle pieces, but for the first time, Misty felt like she was starting to get a sense, broken and confusing as it felt, of what the big picture was going to look like. "Thank you so much for this, Nancy." "Anytime. I'll keep digging into Redstone and Hothmarks and let you know what I learn." Misty was making notes about what Nancy had told her when her buzzer sounded. She hurried to the intercom, hoping maybe Tate had returned. But the voice on the other side belonged to Detective Reyes. "Mind if I come up?" She pressed the button to unlock the outside door and opened hers just as the detective reached the top of the stairs. Ignoring the scowling guard, she said, "I thought you were going to send somebody." "Decided I needed to talk to you in person?" Misty stepped back to let her in. "The letter's on my kitchen counter." Reyes closed the door on the bodyguard and went into the kitchen, slipping on gloves. She put the letter and the envelope in a plastic bag she'd pulled from her back pocket. "We'll look for fingerprints, but I'm guessing we'll only find yours. Worth a shot, though. Can we sit down for a minute?" The kitchen table was covered with papers and files and Misty's laptop, so she led the way into the living room and settled on the sofa. "What's up?" Reyes took the chair. "I know you talked to Detective Klein about Jeffrey Kofer." "Yeah, a couple nights ago. Did you guys find him?" "I'm afraid so. He's dead." Misty gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "Oh my gosh, what happened?" According to the coroner, he was beaten to death, his body tossed into a dumpster. He had no ID on him, which is why it took all week to identify him. His poor family. Do you have any idea who did it? Kofer defended a lot of rough guys, but we can't find anybody who'd have a reason to kill him. The only one who's off the radar is Parks. Why would he kill his attorney, the guy who got him out of prison early? We'll ask him when we find him. Misty let the new information settle, trying to fit the pieces into the puzzle. Tate and I uncovered a few things you might be interested to learn. Tell me. She pulled a little notebook from her pocket, all business. Tate talked to Freddie's mother yesterday morning. Rhea straightened, and by the look on her face, she wasn't happy. But all she said was, "At her apartment?" "In Lowell, yeah. She said she doesn't know where Freddie is." "That's what she told us Saturday." Misty filled Reyes in on everything she and Tate had learned about Freddie and Dawson in the last couple of days. Reyes's pen flew across her paper. "So Parks and Dawson used to be friends, but Parks thinks Dawson killed his sister?" "According to his mom, yeah." Misty went to the kitchen and found the police report Tate had brought the night before. Reyes snatched it from her outstretched hand. "She never regained consciousness," Misty said, "so she couldn't say who'd attacked her. But Miss Parks believes, and says Freddie also believes, that Dawson did it." Reyes scanned the paper. "This is irrelevant. Maybe Parks is after Dawson, but he's also after you. Revenge for putting him away. Maybe he wanted to punish his attorney, too." Misty considered that, but it didn't make sense. "There's more going on here than vengeance. I think maybe we've got this all wrong. I don't think Freddie Parks is after me. And Dawson has no reason to come after me, none that I'm aware of. Not unless they know Tate and I are looking into these old real estate deals. How would they know that? Who else knows what you're up to?" "Nobody, as far as I know. Well, our boss." "You and Tate are digging into, what though? A bribery? And trying to figure out why Parks assaulted that guy in Billerica, and the connection between Thornbrook, the construction company, and IAF, if there is one, and Redstone and Hothmarks." "Which is all," Reyes waved the words away, "way above my pay grade, but if there's something illegal going on there, it'd be a good reason for someone to come after you." "Except we knew nothing about any of it until after somebody tried to bug my apartment. If not for that, we wouldn't be looking into any of this." "Not all criminals are masterminds." Rhea sat back and pressed her lips together, staring at the far wall. Maybe the bug isn't about that case. But if not, then Misty had no idea what it was about. Griffin? But why? Truth was, none of her cases was important enough to risk planting a bug. Her defendants weren't rich or powerful or connected. They were wife-beaters and small-time drug dealers and low-level thugs. Griffin was the exception. Though the man had never been convicted of any crimes, he'd been connected to quite a few, not the least of which was the ambush behind Mr. Hashemi's coffee shop the other day. What could Griffin possibly learn by listening to her meeting with Tate, or by listening to anything Misty said in her apartment? It didn't make sense. Reyes set the paperwork on top of the evidence bag on the coffee table. "You say Tate talked to Miss Parks yesterday?" At Misty's nod, Reyes's lips slipped into a frown. "Did he say anything about her planning to take a trip?" "Not to me. Why?" "We stopped by there this afternoon. Miss Parks and her granddaughter are gone, along with most of their belongings. It seems Freddie and his family have skipped town." "Oh! Oh!" Misty fought to bring all the pieces flying around in her brain together. So maybe, I told you Parks reached out to me when he was still in prison, right? And then when I went to Walpole, he refused to see you. What about it? Assuming his mother is right, and he didn't see me, because he didn't want his mom and niece to suffer the same fate as his sister, maybe he took them somewhere safe so he can tell me, or someone, whatever it was he was going to tell me when he summoned me to the prison. No idea what it is? Not a clue. Reyes nodded slowly. After a minute, she said, "Nice theory, but I wouldn't count on it. Considering the violent way Kofor was beaten, which is very similar to the way Parks's first victim was beaten, I'd say Parks murdered Kofor. No idea why he'd ask you to visit the prison, but I'm guessing it wasn't for any good reason. Which tracks, considering the guy's been off the grid since he got released. No, Parks is our killer, I'm convinced." She stood and headed for the door. "Glad you've got protection. Stay with them until we have him in custody." "What about Griffin?" "Yeah, him too." She managed a slight smile. "You're a magnet for trouble, aren't you?" Kidnapped twice, and now 2 bad guys after her? It sure felt that way.
Chapter 25. The rain had tapered off, but thick clouds hung low overhead, making the late afternoon as dark as dusk. It was a little after 4, and Tate was approaching Misty's apartment building when Detective Reyes pushed out the door. A police cruiser was double parked on the street, a uniformed cop in the driver's seat. Tate quickened his pace. "Detective!" She turned and he called, "Everything okay? You're here to see Ms. Lake?" "Yeah." Worry pounded a drum beat in his chest. "Is she all right? Did something happen?" "She'll fill you in." Reyes gestured for him to follow her back into the building and let the door close. They stood in the lobby between the stairwell and a closed apartment door. "I understand you went to see Winnie Parks." "Yesterday, yeah. When you were there, did you get any sense that they were moving?" "The place was tidy. There were no boxes or luggage." "Why?" "And she didn't mention that they were taking a trip." "No." "What did she say about Freddie?" "That he was lying low and staying away from her." "Did Misty tell you she and Freddie think Dawson killed Layla Parks? Freddie's sister?" "She did." Reyes tilted her chin and raised her eyebrows, gaze boring into his. "You should have told me. That's information I need." "You're right, it's been busy." The detective didn't shift her stare. "What you had to do was more important." "No, of course not. If I learn anything else, I think you need to know." "If you learn anything else, whether you think I should know it or not." "Right, I'll let you know." "You do that." Finally, she broke eye contact and pulled open the door. He took it and held it for her. "Detective." When she turned, he said, "Why are you here?" "Ask your girlfriend. I'm sure she'll fill you in." She descended the steps and climbed into the cruiser. Tate ran up the stairs to the 3rd floor, where Hughes was standing guard. "Everything okay?" Tate asked. He shrugged and knocked on the door himself, calling, "Steele's here." It swung open. The smile Misty had greeted him with that morning was gone. "Come in." He did, closing the door, then pulled her into a hug. Only when she was pressed against him, her arms circling his back, her cheek resting on his chest, did he relax. "I ran into Reyes outside. She told me you were all right, but I needed to see for myself." She didn't let up her grip on him. She was trembling. No, sobbing. "Sweetheart, what happened?" She sniffed and stepped away to wipe her eyes on the sleeve of her sweatshirt. "I'm sorry, it's just—" But she didn't seem to know how to finish the sentence. He took her hand, leading her to the couch. After he slid off his trench coat and draped it over a chair, he sat beside her. "Tell me what happened." "Jeffrey Kofor is dead. He was beaten to death. Reyes thinks Freddie Parks did it." "For what reason?" "That's what I asked. Maybe he's lost his mind. Maybe he's psychotic. Or maybe he thought Kofor knew too much." "About what?" Misty shrugged. "I don't know. There's so much we still don't understand. Just when I think I'm getting a handle on the big picture, someone comes in and rips the puzzle pieces apart. This is why I hate puzzles." She smiled, though it didn't hold, and squeezed his hand. "I'm glad you're here. I wasn't sure if you'd come by tonight or not." "I wanted to see you before—" I actually have plans, but I can cancel. No, don't do that. I'm fine. She sat up straight, shook her head like she was trying to shake off ugly images. Really? It was just a shock, that's all. Hot date? He sat back. Her question had been a joke, but maybe there was more to what she was asking. The two of them had spent a lot of time together, but they'd only been on 2 dates, and they barely counted since they hadn't gone out anywhere. It wasn't like they were exclusive, but he wouldn't mind if they were. If I'd had a date planned for tonight, I'd cancel it to spend the evening with you. You're the only woman I want to date right now. Oh, this time the grin spreading across Misty's face looked genuine. Okay then, I feel the same way. Well, except for the woman part. Did his heart do a little flip at her words? Maybe. Did that make them exclusive? He wasn't sure what it made them, but it seemed they'd taken a step, albeit a tentative one, toward a real relationship. What are you up to tonight? I hang out with friends from my undergrad days once a month. Tonight's the night, but I can cancel if you want me to stay. It's fine. I'll watch a movie and go to bed early. Her phone rang and she reached for it. I think I know who this is, she answered with, Misty Lake. A pause, then, hold on 1 second, okay? Standing, she muted the phone and headed for the kitchen. It's Ernie Phillips, the building inspector who was Parks's assault victim. Oh, great. I'm going to put him on speaker so you can hear. She returned carrying a notebook and pen. But I don't want him to get spooked. I'll be quiet. She tapped the phone screen. Sorry about that. I'm a prosecutor in Suffolk County, but I used to work in Middlesex. You probably don't remember my name, but I know who you are. You got the guy who jumped me thrown in jail, right? That's right. And now he's out. Unfortunately, yes. Could you have prevented that? She pressed her lips closed, lifted her shoulders and dropped them. If I'd known the cop who arrested Parks was dirty, I might have done things differently, but I didn't know. Most cops are trustworthy. It just ticks me off, you know? Ernie Phillips sounded not so much angry as resigned. I called because I need to ask you about the assault, Misty said. Do you know why Parks targeted you? Yeah, of course. His people tried to get me to overlook some problems I found in a building I'd inspected, and I refused. They warned me I'd be sorry, and they were right. Did you know the department let me go? I can't move like I used to. My knees have never been the same, and I get these headaches. I drive for ride-sharing apps. But let me tell you, the money is nothing compared to what I used to make. My wife had to go to work because we couldn't afford health insurance. I'm so sorry to hear that. How frustrating for you. Yeah, considering after I was targeted, the building passed inspection. The building you'd failed? Is that the right term? It's not a test you pass or fail. I found some flaws that needed to be fixed. But before I turned in my report, Parks came after me. At my house. My wife and kid were inside. My son was watching through the windows until Marianne pulled him away. I'm sure that was traumatic for all of you. Misty managed to sound both businesslike and compassionate. Tate had never quite managed the combination, but she made it look easy. My son didn't sleep for weeks. Imagine that, seeing your old man getting the tar beat out of him. My wife probably would have run out there if she wasn't trying to keep him safe. Thank God she didn't. Sounds like she did the right thing, keeping your son safe. So on the building, you wanted some improvements made. The construction was shoddy. I wouldn't let my dog live there. But when I was in the hospital, the department sent over a young guy, and he found no problems. Again, Misty took notes. Maybe they fixed everything? Obviously not, considering a woman died. Whoa, she met Tate's eyes, hers wide with surprise. Who died? What happened? Out at that Hearts and Homes place, Philip said. That refugee lady who was deaf and didn't hear the alarm? The carbon monoxide leak was the result of faulty installation of the furnace, which was on my list of things they needed to fix. Tate closed his eyes, trying to fit all the pieces together. Hearts and Homes was an IAF project. Had it been built by Thornbrook? Had Dawson been involved back then? He felt like they were finally closing in on what was going on. Did you report that? Misty asked. It was months before I even remembered all that stuff. When I did, I called my old boss and told him what I just told you. He thanked me for the information and hung up. Do you know if he did anything about it? You'd have to ask him, but I'd guess not. And you didn't feel the need to report any of this to the authorities? Tate didn't miss the censure in Misty's tone, and figured Mr. Phillips didn't either. Why would I? The man asked. I went up against those people once and almost died. That guy ruined my life. You know how much I make now? Not enough to keep my house, that's for sure. We lost everything. You really think I was going to open myself up to that again? Misty scowled at the phone, but Tate understood where the man was coming from. Aside from the pain and the loss of income, the humiliation must have been awful. Why risk it again? Mr. Phillips had tried to do the right thing, and he'd been punished in the worst way. No, not the worst way. Parks had to live with his sister's death and the belief that he was responsible, assuming Miss Parks had been telling the truth. Now, I told you all that stuff, Phillips said, but you gotta keep my name out of whatever you're doing. I don't have much left, but I sure as heck don't want to lose it. My wife's busting her butt to take care of our family, and neither one of us needs any more trouble. You've been very helpful. Maybe you think so, or maybe I just put a target on your back. Freddie Parks is psycho. The last thing you want is to be on the wrong side of his fists. Watch yourself. I'll do my best. Misty ended the call and bent over her notebook, scratching notes. Tate closed his eyes and thought about what they'd learned, trying to make the pieces fit. It's all connected. Misty pushed to her feet, tossing her notebook on the coffee table. Hearts and Homes is an IAF property. Parks took Ernie Phillips out of the picture. Maybe somebody, Thornbrook, IAF, Dawson, or someone else, intimidated the replacement inspector, and he overlooked the problems to avoid Ernie's fate. Or maybe he was incompetent, Tate suggested. She threw up a hand, accepting that. Either way, the building passed, refugees moved in, and then, when was the carbon monoxide leak? Tate pulled his laptop from his bag and searched. He found an article about it. He looked at her as the date of the woman's death fit into the calendar in his head. February. Misty's eyes widened. Late in the month? She died on February 27th. Freddie reached out to me about then. So, Misty paced to the bay window and back. So maybe Freddie realized that by taking Ernie Phillips off the board, he'd enabled that building to pass. Maybe he was feeling guilty for that woman's death. Which was what he wanted to confess, Tate said. But Dawson warned him off. For whatever reason, maybe Parks refused to budge, or just to give Parks a taste of what would happen if he defied them, Dawson attacked Layla Parks. And she died, Tate said. Probably not Dawson's plan, but still, murder is murder. Parks got nervous. He couldn't protect his mother and niece from prison, so he refused to see you. But that doesn't mean he got over it. Misty froze in the middle of the room. He was supposed to stay in prison another 5 years, but suddenly he got out, thanks to Kofor. Her voice lowered, trailed at the end. She took a breath and resumed pacing. Which is why I don't think Parks killed Kofor. Doesn't make sense. The guy got him out of prison years early. As far as I know, he's not suspected of being involved in any other crimes. He is, Tate clarified. He's suspected of killing Kofor and breaking into your apartment, but nothing before his release. Right, Misty said. So why would he kill his lawyer, his advocate? Tate didn't have any answers, and her silence told him she didn't either. She sat beside him. It goes back to IAF and Thornbrook. And maybe Redstone, Tate said. What have you learned about that? Redstone's a real estate developer owned by a corporation called Hothmarks. Ever heard of it? Nope. Tate glanced at his watch. It was after 5. You need to go? Misty asked. I don't want to leave you, but if he wanted to be on time to meet his friends, he should have left already. Go! She pushed to her feet. Seriously, I'll be fine. I have leftover pot roast and Netflix. I need to get my mind off all this stuff for the night. A distraction? He stood and took her hand. I can think of a few ways to distract you. He waggled his eyebrows and she smiled. That might be more fun than watching a movie. Might? He took her in his arms and pulled her close, gazing at her upturned face, those wide, beautiful eyes, those very kissable lips. He bent to taste them, then dove in for more. Misty snaked her arms around his neck, her fingers tickling the hair at the back of his neck and sending desire through his body. He held her closer, deepening the kiss. His mind wandered to all the ways they could spend the evening, which had him loosening his hold and ending the kiss. "I'm almost convinced," she said. He chuckled. "Maybe I should stay." "No." She stepped away, leaving him chilly and wanting more. "You have plans. If you're not busy, maybe you could come over tomorrow." Of course. It hadn't occurred to him that he wouldn't. There was the mystery they were trying to solve, but it was more than that. The idea of going an entire day without seeing her, that was why he needed to go. One night apart wasn't going to hurt them. They'd spent so much time together. Maybe they both needed a little distance to figure out how they felt. He did for sure, because his feelings were going very deep, very fast. He couldn't tell if that was because Misty was the perfect woman for him, or if he was confusing his concern for her well-being for something it wasn't. Maybe he could fall in love with her. Maybe she could fall in love with him. Or maybe circumstances had thrust them together and danger had acted as glue. He needed to know now, before either one of them got hurt. "I'll go under one condition," Tate said. Her eyebrows hiked. "What's that?" "If anything happens, you call me, okay? With Kofor dead, this whole thing seems more dangerous than it did before. I won't be able to relax with my friends or sleep tonight unless I know you'll call if you need me." She moved closer and wrapped her arms around him. "You do the same, all right? If this is about all the stuff we're learning, you could be in just as much danger as I am."
Chapter 26. A distant shout pulled Misty from sleep. Past the blinds, she saw only darkness. Street noises rarely reached to her 8th-floor apartment, but had little trouble seeping through Summer's 3rd-floor windows. Misty turned over to go back to sleep. Something pounded, not coming from outside. She swung her feet over the side of the bed. The pounding came again. "Ms. Lake, it's Hughes. Open up!" Heart racing, she snatched her bathrobe, slipping it on as she ran down the hall. She bolted through the living room to the door. "What's going on?" "Open up, now!" Definitely Hughes. She yanked the door open. "Let's go." "What? What's—" "Now, Misty." His use of her first name snapped her out of her stupor. He gripped her upper arm and pulled. She had no idea what was going on, but Summer trusted Hughes, and Misty trusted Summer. She followed him outside the apartment and closed the door. He manhandled her, not toward the staircase going down, but toward the other end of the hall, where it led up. "Hurry!" Something popped. Was that a gunshot? Below, a door banged open. Hughes turned and held a finger over his lips. She pressed her mouth closed and nodded. They climbed silently. Tension in her chest squeezed until she wanted to scream. But she knew when it was time to scream and when it was time to hide. This was definitely time to hide. They continued past the 4th floor, up to the door to the roof. Hughes unlocked it and pushed it open. After she stepped onto the roof, he closed the door quietly and pulled her around to the back of the little building that housed the stairwell, putting himself between her and the door. She barely registered the rain and chilly wind, just watching him as his gaze scanned the rooftop. He said nothing, and she couldn't seem to make words form. After a few long seconds, he said, "Go hide behind those boxes." He pointed, and she saw what he meant. They were some kind of electrical things. They were small, though. Too small to hide her. "Maybe I could hide behind the couch." The outdoor furniture would be big enough. "Hopefully the cops will get up here before he does. But if not, that's the first place he'll look." Hughes gripped Misty's upper arms and leaned down to meet her eyes. "Trust me. Do as I say. Do not move until I tell you to. Got it?" She nodded, and he practically pushed her toward the small boxes. She ran across the roof and crouched behind them. Her bare knees hit cold, wet tile. She bent low, trying to get her terry cloth bathrobe to cover more skin, trying to make her too tall body smaller. She wanted to peek, to see what was happening, but she didn't. Instead, she closed her eyes, fighting panic. Memories of her childhood assailed her, all those nights hiding while her father shouted curses, the slap of flesh, the thud of fists, screaming, begging, crying. This wasn't that. Mom was gone. Crystal and Summer were safe. Dad was alone in his house, suffering the consequences of a lifetime of poor choices. Crouched on the wet roof, Misty felt like that scared little girl, hiding behind her big sister. A sister who, like the electrical boxes, hadn't been big enough. Please keep me safe. Keep my guards safe. Far away, a siren sounded. Closer, a door creaked. Footsteps ran. Misty covered her head with her arms as if thin flesh and bone could protect her. Oomph! The sound was muffled, then more grunts. Who was fighting? Who was winning? She wanted to look, but Hughes had told her to stay hidden, to trust him. She opened her eyes and kept watch on the tiny bit of floor in front of her. What would she do if someone came? He'd be too close to run away from. She'd be trapped. Again. Maybe this time she wouldn't survive. Clear! A man's voice. Could it have been? Clear! Another man shouted. A third voice cursed a blue streak. Shut up or we'll do it for you. That was definitely Hughes. Ms. Lake, it's safe now. She stood from behind the boxes. Hughes and... Oh, it was Ian, the one who'd been shot. She hadn't seen him since the coffee shop. He'd apparently recovered because he crouched over a man who was face down. He looked at her and grinned. You all right? Was she? Her stomach was churning, and she feared she might be sick. She swallowed again. Ian's smile faded. She forced words past her lips. I'm okay. Hughes hadn't lost that intense look he always seemed to wear. Come on before you freeze. She hurried across the roof, and he slipped off his jacket and draped it over her shoulders. Let's get you inside. To Ian, he said, You good here? Ian was sitting on the guy's legs. He'd already secured the intruder's hands behind his back with zip-tie cuffs and was doing the same with his feet. He's not going anywhere. From the open doorway, the pounding of footsteps reached her. She backed away, ready to run. It's the police. You're safe. Hughes gripped Misty's arm, but she shrugged away to get a look at the intruder's face, believing she was about to come face to face with Parks for the first time since he'd threatened her in the courtroom. But it wasn't Parks, or Griffin. A stranger looked back at her. She let Hughes lead her through the door and into the stairwell. They'd just reached the landing between the roof and the fourth floor when uniformed police officers running up the stairs met them. He's on the roof, Hughes said. We'll be in Ms. Lake's apartment. 3B. Got it. The cops continued past. Did somebody get shot? Misty asked. Did I hear gunshots? Ian was trying to slow them down. He saw them approach the building and start working the lock. He told me and then called 911. They reached Summer's apartment. The door was wide open. It looked like it had been kicked in. She'd have to deal with that. Eventually, she stepped inside and stopped in the entry, unsure what to do next. Did anybody get hurt? She asked. Not as far as I know. With a hand on her arm, Hughes led her to the couch and gently urged her down. Blankets? She couldn't think, but he found a throw in a basket by the fireplace and tossed it over her. You probably should change into something dry. She would, in a minute. She pulled her legs up to her chest and huddled beneath the blanket, only this moment feeling the chill. Her teeth chattered. Who was that guy? The cops'll figure it out. Hughes checked the windows. She wasn't sure if he was worried or just expending nervous energy. He returned from the kitchen and stood opposite the coffee table. You really should get dressed. The police will want to question you. I assume you'll want to be wearing something else. Right. She was in pajamas and a bathrobe. She needed socks, a sweatshirt, pants. She stood, wrapping the blanket around her shoulders, and shuffled to the bedroom. After she closed the door, she stood there, stupidly, for a long time. She might have thought it was a bad dream if not for the damp clothes. Someone had come after her. It was real and altogether too familiar. Memories played like a slideshow in the back of her mind. The kidnapping. The other kidnapping. All the fears and worries, all the terror of those events, seemed to crowd into the too small bedroom, settling like uninvited guests. Her stomach roiled, churned. She swallowed, but this time, the nausea wouldn't be denied. She bolted out of the room and into the bathroom, barely making it to the toilet before she threw up. When she was finished, she washed her hands and brushed her teeth and stared at her image. "You're okay." The woman in the mirror didn't look convinced. Voices came from down the hall. She needed to dress and go out there and talk to the police. She needed to find out who that guy was and why he'd come after her. Back in her bedroom, she slipped into a pair of jeans and the sweatshirt she'd worn earlier. She added socks and sneakers since her feet were freezing. Then she grabbed her phone and checked the time. 2:37 a.m. She'd missed a message from Tate. He'd texted at 10:30, but she'd been sleeping. "I hope you had a good night. I missed you. Talk to you tomorrow." Sweet of him to check in. She hated that she hadn't texted back, but seeing his name reminded her that she'd promised to call if anything happened. Getting yanked from her bed and hiding from a bad guy, a gunman, on the roof definitely qualified. It could wait until morning. It wasn't as if Tate could protect her from an event that had already occurred. But she wanted to talk to him. She needed to tell somebody. What if Tate hadn't really wanted her to call? What if he'd just wanted to seem like he cared? She took a steadying breath, though it came out shaky. If that was the case, better she knew now that the man couldn't be counted on. She lifted her phone and dialed. He answered on the second ring, voice groggy with sleep. "Misty, you all right?" Suddenly, emotion clogged her throat. "Yeah." The word came out high-pitched. "What happened?" "I'm not sure yet. Somebody tried to get to me, I think. I have to go out and talk to the police, but you asked..." "You're at home, or Summers?" "Uh-huh. Are you hurt?" "No, just..." Again, she fought tears trying to seep into her voice. "I'm all right." "Someone's with you?" "Hughes and Ian and the police. I'm on my way. Call if you need me, okay?" She couldn't speak. Her words were clogged, her eyes leaking tears, her throat swollen and aching. "Misty." "Okay?" The squeaky word was barely audible, but he must have heard it. "I'll be right there." She could tell by the noises coming through the phone that he was already up and moving. "You'll be okay until I get there?" "Yeah." She swallowed, cleared her throat. "Yeah, I'll go out and talk to them." "Good, tell them I'm coming." She ended the call, shoved her cell in her pocket, and opened her door. It was time to figure out what was going on.
Chapter 27. Tate left his car in an almost legal spot near the police cruisers lining the street. It was no longer raining, but the air was cool and thick with moisture as he jogged to Summers' building. A cop was standing on the stoop. Tate started up the stairs. "You live here?" the officer asked. "I'm here to see Misty Lake. I'm a friend." "Name?" "Tate Steele." "Hang tight." He spoke into the little radio on his collar. "Steele's here." There was no answer, at least not one Tate heard. "Can I go up now?" "Someone will come down." He was itching to get inside. He'd been sound asleep when she called, but the tone of her voice, the tears and fear he heard, had hit him like a bucket of ice water. He'd been dressed and out of his apartment in minutes. Now he paced in front of the building, getting more worried by the minute. Finally, the door opened, and Detective Reyes came out and joined him on the sidewalk. "What are you doing here?" "Misty called me. What happened?" "Come on in." Thank God. He followed her into the building, but she didn't start up the stairs. "What do you know about what happened here tonight?" Misty said someone tried to get to her, but that she was okay. Her bodyguards protected her, right? She's not hurt? According to Misty, you were the only person who knew where she was staying. Tate opened his mouth to respond, then snapped it shut. The scene reframed itself in his mind. Someone had attacked Misty, and Reyes suspected him. Of what exactly, he wasn't sure. Surely she didn't think he'd try to hurt Misty, but it was her job to suspect everybody. More to the point, as far as Tate knew, he had been the only person who knew where Misty was staying. Yet someone had found her. How? Tate hadn't done anything criminal, but maybe he'd done something stupid and led her enemies here. That remained to be seen. Either way, he needed to tread carefully. "Did you have a question for me, Detective? Who did you tell?" He thought back to the conversations he'd had that week. The only person he'd talked to about Misty was Leland. Had he mentioned where she was? Maybe. "I might have told Leland Humphreys, the DA. My boss, our boss. He was worried about her safety after the intruder, and I told him she wasn't staying at home. I might have told him she was staying at her sister's place. I don't remember the conversation word for word. You were asked not to share her location, and yet you did. With her boss, who's a high-ranking law enforcement official and who understood she was keeping her whereabouts quiet. It's not like I posted it on social media." "Who else did you tell?" "Nobody." "You're certain about that?" "Absolutely." She watched him for a long moment, maybe waiting for him to confess his crimes and beg for mercy. "Okay," she said. "Who knew you and Misty are dating?" "We weren't. I mean, we are dating now, but we weren't last weekend. That's a new development, but I haven't told anybody." He thought about all the stupid things suspects did and said, things that were used to put them away. Most suspects' biggest problem was their inability to shut up, so he'd answer the questions she posed and hope she figured out the right ones to ask. She huffed a breath. "Before the new development developed, did you tell anyone you and she were spending time together?" "Leland knows we're working closely together because he asked me to assist her on some cases." "Besides the DA, for instance, maybe you told Winnie Parks." "Not that I can recall." "That's a very well-crafted answer, short and to the point." "I'm a prosecutor, Detective. I know what you're doing." "What am I doing?" He didn't answer. "Do you want to help me or not?" "I do, absolutely. But I don't want you to waste time on me. I would never willingly, knowingly put Misty in danger." "Is it possible you unwillingly, unknowingly put her in danger?" Though he hated to admit it, he nodded. "Though I haven't told anybody at the office I'm working with Misty, it's possible somebody guessed." "How would that have happened?" "By following the clues. For instance, when we got that list of people who had access to the calendar for you." He waited until Reyes nodded before continuing. "I'm the one who called HR and asked them to send it to Misty. Also, I've accessed some of her files for her. I've been in her office a couple of times this week to grab things for her. It's possible somebody saw me doing those things and guessed I was working with her." Reyes reached toward him, curled her hand into a fist and pulled it back, like she was trying to pull words out of him. "Keep going, Steele. If somebody figured out I was working with her, or even overheard me talking to Leland yesterday in the office, they could have followed me here." Reyes dropped her arm. "Seems plausible. Which makes this my fault." The truth of it settled like a barbell on his throat. His carelessness could have gotten her killed. "Anybody come to mind?" Reyes asked. "What do you mean?" "At the office. Did you see anybody watching you? Or hanging around when you were talking to Leland?" He squeezed his eyes closed. He'd seen a few people walk by his open office door, but only one who'd peeked in. "I can tell by the look on your face you have a name for me." He opened his eyes. "This guy and I are rivals. I mean, I'm going to be really honest here. He's the only person I work with who I don't like. So if you talk to him, he's going to tell you that. And it's going to be true." "What's his name?" "Clinton Lowe, bootlicker in chief." She wrote it down, then looked up again. "Why don't you like him?" "He's an arrogant, weaselly, name-dropping jerk." "Is that all?" For the first time during their conversation, Reyes's expression softened. "I'm sure I could think of a few more adjectives, but you'll come up with your own when you meet him." "Oh." Something else occurred to him. "What?" "Kyle Griffin was arrested for beating up his girlfriend a while back. Lowe was the DA on the case. He dropped the charges." "Why?" "You'll have to ask him. When I confronted him, he didn't say. Come to think of it, I told him Misty was the prosecutor of the stalking case. So you might have been the one to put Griffin on her in the first place?" "No, I confronted him after the ambush. The point is, he knew Griffin, and he knew, or at least could have guessed, Misty and I were working together. I'm just saying, maybe there's something there." She flipped the notebook closed. "All right, that's helpful. You're off the hook for now. But don't take any trips until this is cleared up." Don't worry, I'm not going anywhere. Except upstairs, if that's all right. She stepped out of the way and he took the stairs 2 at a time to the 3rd floor. A bodyguard he hadn't met before was standing outside. I'm Tate Steele. The man knocked and the door swung open. Tate looked past all the men in the room to Misty. She stood and crossed the room toward him. Her hair was disheveled, her skin pale with dark smudges beneath her eyes. But she was alive and well, and as far as he could tell, uninjured. Right in front of everyone, she fell into his arms. Thank God, he said. Thank God you're okay.